Howdy readers, I'm Jason. This is Chapter and Verse, and this is my second Shaketube video of 2019. For those of you who are maybe new to Shaketube or new to BookTube in general, Shaketube is a September-long celebration of Shakespeare, the works of William Shakespeare. And just as last year, this year, Shaketube is co-hosted by myself, Lukash from Totally Pretentious, and Steve Donahue. I will leave links to their announcement videos below, as well as my own announcement videos, so that you can see what plays I'll be reading through the rest of September, as well as what plays they'll be reading through the rest of September. But this week, I am going to be talking about Hamlet, right? So specifically the second quarto version of Hamlet. But before we jump into this, I wanted to let everybody know that I have a Shaketube playlist that you can check out, and it has Shaketube videos from a whole bunch of booktubers from last year as well as from this year. So if you like what you find here and elsewhere as per Shaketube, check out the playlist, because there's a lot of really good stuff going on and that has gone on. So in rereading Hamlet this time, I have not read it in probably 12 years. I did not take notes this time around. I just used my Post-its, right, which you've seen in books that I've held up before. And what I decided I would do this time, instead of taking notes and kind of working through my notes in my notebook with you, I thought we would just go through the play together and talk about some of my little Post-it notes, the things that I marked that were of interest to me this time around. And many of them were things that I had never really thought about before, or had never, insofar as I can remember, come up in a classroom discussion of Hamlet, of which I have been part of many. So the very first sticky that I have in Hamlet, it's just a simple thing, a few lines in, and it's where we have one guard relieving another guard, right, presumably on the castle wall. And Bernardo says, "'Tis now struck 12, get thee to bed, Francisco." And Francisco responds, "For this relief, much thanks. 'Tis bitter cold, and I am sick at heart." And what I love about that line is that from the get-go, Shakespeare is giving us cues that allow us to suspend our disbelief, to forget that we're watching something unfold on a stage. He's talking about the weather. He's talking about the climate. And he does that throughout the play. And I find that really wonderful as not only a reader of the play, but when one sees a play performed. And I think I would find it invaluable if I was directing a production or a film of Hamlet. There are all kinds of little things actually through Hamlet that feel like directions for the director, although they're not actually stage directions, if that makes any sense. See, second Post-it here. So after the ghost makes his appearance to Horatio and the other guards who have seen him before, I found it very strange that Shakespeare then launches into what is basically an info dump about the previous King Hamlet's experience with the previous Fortinbras. It feels like it has no place in this act. It's not at all organically introduced. And yeah, I mean, when I had read the play in the past, maybe I thought that as well, but the phrase info dump was not in my vernacular at that time. Now that it is, thanks to BookTube, it struck me straight away that that's what this is. And that's not where one should go, William, when beginning a play with the appearance of a ghost. You stay with that. You stay with the amazement. You stay with the horror. You stay with the wonder. You do not abruptly transition from that into an info dump about the warlike history of the nation in which the action is taking place. That's a bad move, inadvisable, one might say. And then in Act 1, Scene 2, we have Claudius, the king, and he is talking to Laertes and Polonius. And what I find really interesting about this scene as well is that Hamlet is present for this. The young Hamlet, the main character, is present for this. He is essentially in the background while this exchange is taking place. But anyways, Claudius the king says, "And now, Laertes, what's the news with you? You told us of some suit. What is it, Laertes? You cannot speak of reason to the Dane and lose your voice. What wouldst thou beg, Laertes, that shall not be my offer, not thy asking? The head is not more native to the heart, the hand more instrumental to the mouth, than is the throne of Denmark to thy father. What wouldst thou have, Laertes?" And then Laertes says, "My dread lord, your leave and favor to return to France, from whence, though willingly, I came to Denmark to show my duty in your coronation." So there are a couple of things I want to talk about with this. So just a little while later in this act, Hamlet meets up with Horatio. Horatio is not expected to be there. Hamlet asks him, why are you here? Why have you come back from university? And Horatio tells him, it was for your father's funeral. And Hamlet tells him, essentially, don't mock me. I'm sure it was to see my mother's wedding to my father's brother. And I find it interesting that can be kind of juxtaposed or stands alongside Laertes confessing to Claudius, or admitting to Claudius his own reason for having returned. And he tells Claudius that it was to see Claudius's coronation. I suspect Laertes actually returned for the funeral of the previous king, but Laertes here is appealing to Claudius's vanity. And Claudius is clearly someone who likes having his vanity appealed to. Whereas later in the act, when Horatio and Hamlet are having their conversation, I think that Horatio is genuinely sincere when he tells Hamlet that he had returned for Hamlet's father's funeral. And that just shows you a great deal, I think, about the character of these two young men, Laertes and Horatio. The other thing I wanted to talk about in that little speech there, in that little section, was when Claudius is talking about Polonius, right? Let's see. He says, "The head is not more native to the heart, the hand more instrumental to the mouth, than is the throne of Denmark to thy father." What I find so fascinating about that is that basically what Claudius is telling us is that Polonius is completely knitted up in the business of the throne, presumably then of who sits on the throne. And I've never wondered this before, but here later in Act 1, let's see here, when Hamlet is talking with the ghost of his father, the ghost says, "Now Hamlet, hear, 'tis given out that, sleeping in my orchard, a serpent stung me." Okay? And I had never noticed that before. "'Tis given out that." Like, what the hell does that mean? And so I consulted my footnotes, and the footnotes say, given out, announced publicly, presumably by the king and supporters. Okay? So the ghost is telling Hamlet that he knows he was killed by his brother, that he, the ghost of the previous king, knows that he was killed by Claudius, not because he was made aware of it as it was happening, but because people around Claudius have not been bashful about speaking about it, which I find really, really fascinating. And it made me wonder then if people in the court, if people in the kingdom around the king are being that open about it, or that kind of braggart about it, who else knows? And who else was a part of it? Was Polonius somehow involved with the killing of the previous king, Hamlet? Claudius, in that bit that I read just a few minutes ago, talks about Polonius's relationship with the throne of Denmark, right? That he couldn't be closer to it. He couldn't be more instrumental to it. And then if we just consider the fact as well that Polonius seems to like to have his hands in everything. He orchestrates Ophelia's breakup with Hamlet, or spurning of Hamlet is probably a better way to put it. He sends somebody essentially to spy on his son when his son is away at school in France. Polonius seems to be somebody who likes to spin webs. Now, he doesn't seem terribly bright, But watching any film or reading any news story is enough to make us all realize that one doesn't need to be bright to be involved in something like this, like the killing of a king. So I don't know. What do you guys think? I think it's really telling that the ghost tells Hamlet that he came by this information because people were being vocal about it. And if people are being vocal about it, that means there's a strong possibility that Gertrude knows. And if Gertrude knows, was Gertrude involved with it? Was she aware of it? Was she sleeping with Claudius before her husband's death? Did she know what the plan was? When he confronts her in her chambers later in the play, is telling her, like, why is this happening, right? Like, you're too old, for this to be a question of libido, basically. So he's puzzled by it. Like, why is it happening? So then one might wonder if it was happening before the death of her husband. If that was maybe somehow part of or a kind of instigation of the death of her husband. Hamlet likes to think that the relationship between his parents was absolutely perfect, but I think that all children like to think that, especially when they're young and impressionable. And granted, Hamlet's not like a kid or anything. He's in his late 20s or maybe even 30 years old. But yeah, he doesn't want to think that his mother could possibly know about this, right? Any guilt that is laid at her doorstep, I feel like is incidental in his eyes. But it just makes me wonder. 'Tis given out that sleeping in my orchard, a serpent stung me. So the whole ear of Denmark is by a forged process of my death rankly abused. I don't know. You guys let me know what you think about that. Let's move on to a few other little stickies here. Some things that I was struck by, some things that I really, really liked. So in Act 3, Scene 2, Hamlet is talking with Horatio ahead of the Mousetrap being performed, the play that Hamlet doctors in an attempt to catch the conscience of the king, in his words. And I found this really fascinating, these lines here. Hamlet says, and blessed are those whose blood and judgment are so well co-mettled that they are not a pipe for fortune's finger to sound what stop she please. And I found that really interesting because by blood he means irrationality, temper, right? Passions, people being governed by their passions. So there's this idea that people whose passions are somehow in balance with their reason, right, with their sense of judgment and their sense of caution and care, that those people are blessed, that those people are favored somehow. When Kelly was reading the play, she asked me at one point why, I don't know why it was considered such a great play. What was it about it that made it unique or groundbreaking or what have you? And I have certainly not read very much at all in the way of drama that preceded Hamlet. But I think one of the things that makes Hamlet extraordinary and makes it kind of stand alone is the fact that this is a play about huge feeling and self-conscious reflection. And in the character of Hamlet, we have him like a pendulum kind of moving back and forth between wild, manic, passionate action and very careful, reasoned, precise reflection. And I think it's a play that's very much about moving between those two poles. And this is true of any of us, right? This is what life is. Even down to something like posting on Facebook, right? I don't know how many times in the past Kelly has told me, don't post anything on Facebook while you're angry. Like, think about it a little bit first, let yourself cool off, and you are going to articulate what you mean in a way that is going to inspire people to think rather than piss them off. She is right. And this is a play that is very much about that. How do we do that? And I think that's just one of the things that makes the character feel revolutionary, that he he knows that's what's going on in him, right? He is aware of this. And I think there's something exhilarating about that, frankly. So a perfect example, right, of Hamlet checking himself is when he sees Claudius praying. And he says, now might I do it, but now he is a praying, and now I'll do it. He draws his sword. And so he goes to heaven, and so am I revenged. That would be scanned. A villain kills my father, and for that I, his sole son, do this same villain send to heaven. So I find it fascinating, right, that Hamlet in that moment is almost overcome enough to kill Claudius while Claudius is praying, but he prevents himself from doing it because he knows that in doing it, the odds of Claudius being forgiven by God are greater because Claudius is in the act of praying. If there's ever been a character who maybe overthinks things a little bit, that character is Hamlet. But it makes for really exciting reading, actually. So here's another thing that I've never really thought of before, and I don't really understand. I just wanted to kind of throw this out to you guys and see what you think. So in a scene in Gertrude's chambers, after Hamlet has killed Polonius, when the ghost appears in her chambers, Hamlet sees the ghost. The ghost chides Hamlet, right? Reminds him of his mission, his duty to his father. But Gertrude doesn't see the ghost. Why doesn't she see the ghost? Do you guys have any thoughts on that? Because Horatio sees the ghost, right? Marcellus, he's just an average dude, just like a night watchman who is really barely even in the play. Marcellus sees the ghost. It's not like, the ghost only appears to Hamlet. Why is Gertrude not seeing it? What's that all about? If, in fact, she had some part in it, might that have something to do with it? And what about that? Was she involved somehow in the murder of her husband? In Act 4, Scene 5, when Ophelia, who has gone absolutely mad, whose cheese has done slid off her cracker, makes her appearance, the queen, in an aside to the audience, says, "To my sick soul, as sin's true nature is, each toy seems prologue to some great amiss. So full of artless jealousy is guilt, it spills itself in fearing to be spilt." I don't know. What is she talking about there? I tried to figure it out, and I'm not 100% sure. But because it's an aside, I feel like she could be talking about herself. That seems to be the case. When Claudius first has an aside in the play, if I remember correctly, he is talking about his own actions. He's talking about having killed his brother. And he's talking about it to himself and to us, not in such a way that other characters are going to be privy to it. That tends to be what asides are all about, is when characters are thinking aloud about themselves and about what's going on in them. And so when she says, "So full of artless jealousy is guilt, it spills itself in fearing to be spilt," what the hell is she on about? I don't know. That's one of the great things, I suppose, about Hamlet, right? Is that it inspires as many questions in us as it provides answers to the questions we bring it, or we've been encouraged to bring it by our teachers, by pop culture, by BookTube, and just another couple of things I wanted to bring up. So in Act 4, Scene 7, we have an exchange between Claudius the king and Laertes. And Claudius opens this scene with these lines: "Now must your conscience my acquittance seal, and you must put me in your hearts for friend, sith you have heard, and with a knowing ear, that he which hath your noble father slain pursued my life." So I could be wrong, but I think this is the first time in the play that Claudius is referring to himself in singular first person, right? So he is not referring to himself with the royal we anymore, which has been his wont, not just because he's king, but because he is just vain as all hell. But here he is referring to himself as me and my. And what is this? Lines 35 and 36. In that scene, he says, "You shortly shall hear more. I loved your father, and we love ourself." Right. So, and that I hope will teach you to imagine. Right. And then a messenger appears with letters. So in that single line, he's referring to himself as an individual, as a person. I loved your father, and then as a royal personage, and we love ourself. And I find it very interesting that he is kind of compartmentalizing right there, because later in that scene is when he and Laertes concoct the plan to kill Hamlet with the poison on the tip of the rapier. And I don't know, it makes me wonder, right, about the possibility that people who commit crimes like that, who commit murders and whatnot, that they might be able to compartmentalize their lives, right? That they might be able to persuade themselves that that the person that is them going out and committing these crimes is not them. And I just find it terribly convenient for Claudius to be able to do this in this scene, to refer to himself as I and as we, and then to plot to kill Hamlet, which would be a preservation of his crown. I find that interesting. Maybe I'm crazy. Maybe I'm reading too much into it. But that's part of the beauty of reading Shakespeare, is that it can stand a lot of interpretations, I think, so long as what you're getting out of it is from the text itself. And then the very last thing I wanted to address, which goes kind of hand in hand with what I was talking about there, this idea of compartmentalizing, this idea of someone who's committing a crime being one person and being the person committing the crime. This kind of dissociation, I suppose. So in Act 5, Scene 2, so Hamlet, I think this is right before Hamlet and Laertes begin dueling, and Hamlet is explaining to Laertes, he's apologizing for what he has done, the role that he's played in the murder of Polonius and the death of Ophelia. And he says, "Was it Hamlet?" Hamlet is saying this. "Was it Hamlet wronged Laertes? Never Hamlet. If Hamlet from himself be taken away, and when he's not himself does wrong Laertes, then Hamlet does it not. Hamlet denies it. Who does it then? His madness. If it be so, Hamlet is of the faction that is wronged. His madness is poor Hamlet's enemy." And that, of course, makes me think of the ways in which the brains of psychopaths are broken. So psychopaths are incapable of feeling empathy. And so to what extent, then, is someone who commits a murder, right, or multiple murders, right, a serial killer, something like this, yes, they're the one doing it, but because their brain is broken and they have no control over that, because one of the things that would prohibit them from committing those murders is empathy, is something that they biologically are incapable of. They're chemically incapable of. To what extent, then, are they guilty? To what extent, then, are they not a victim, but somehow misused by their own brain as well? This is part of why I don't support the death penalty, because these people who do these things, yes, they've done these things. Yes, they need to be punished for these things, held accountable, imprisoned, reformed, etc., etc. But to kill them when in actual fact, their brains are faulty somehow. Their brains are defective. They don't actually know right from wrong, some of these people. They don't understand what empathy is. I just don't see how a society can, in good conscience, take the life of somebody who has taken life without knowing why they shouldn't, I suppose. So anyway, reading the play this time took me a very long time. I was trying to understand it as well as humanly possible for this video, and so I spent probably 8 hours reading these 5 acts. which was difficult, and which is partly why this video is a day late. But anyway, let me know in the comments below what you think of Hamlet and what you think of some of my crazy ideas. And I will see you guys again very soon. Next week, we're going to be reading The Winter's Tale. So I hope some of you will be able to join in that with me. Adios.